but is still disproportionately in the top half of the income distribution. And what's interesting is that if most people's wealth is mostly housing, it isn't clear that the decline in equity share values has exceeded the decline in the value of your houses. It's interesting that if you look at the least bad information we have about the very top of the distribution from the newspapers, which is the Sunday Times Rich List, the average decline in wealth for the top 250, which is what they cover for Ireland, was of the order of 25% over the last year. Now you might say, well, house prices have probably gone down more than that. But of course, one of the substantial issues for some people who in wealth terms is the people who've gone into negative equity. They're not just worrying about the decline in their assets; they've gone negative on their housing. And we've seen, as I say, shareholders who didn't have perhaps very many shares and were concentrated in ones that have done particularly badly have been particularly hard hit. But it's still the case that income from those shares constitutes a small proportion of total income at most parts. So in some sense, perhaps, you might say that the biggest impact in wealth terms is to narrow the gap between those with and those without wealth, because the value of anybody who had any has seen it, or most people who had any have seen it as well. Now, I just want to talk very briefly about poverty. I'm conscious of the clock. This is what happened to one of the commonly used measures of poverty, which focuses on the relative income position of households. And the proportion of households that fall below a certain proportion of the middle of the distribution, the median. The conventional measures used take on half the median, 60%, and they show the same pattern. Now, if you look at what happened over our boom years to this measure, you can see that rather counterintuitively, if you start thinking about it, this measure went up during the early part of the boom and then started declining. And essentially what that reflects is that those who continued to be reliant on social welfare transfers, and in particular pensioners, a very large proportion of whom are reliant on those transfers, lagged behind average income during the height of the 90s part of the boom, and then caught up as social welfare and pensions in particular caught up, and we saw the benefit of the increase in employment. Now, that is not the measure that dead. That is not the measure that the government targets. What they target is a measure which focuses on those who are both on low income and displaying what you might call manifest deprivation. This measure, which a bunch of us developed, showed sharp declines in the boom years, and there's a break then from 2001 to 2004, both because the data source changes and because the indicators used were altered. But you can see that it was also declining up to 2007. And the government's target to about 5%. The government's target was to get that below 4, which now looks rather optimistic. Okay, sorry. Now, I think I'm just going to mostly said that. So what should we do? This has quite a lot of overlap with just one pattern. And thank you very much, gentlemen. What should we do? How do we respond to try and cushion the impact of the recession on poverty in particular, but also perhaps on inequality? The single most important thing, it seems to me, is what we do about unemployment. Now, there's a lot of overlap here with what John has already said. What I want to emphasize is that there is a great deal to be said for thinking about the distribution of the burden of unemployment as well as the level. That we know that long-term unemployment has a very long-lasting scarring effect on those who experience it. And we should be taking measures that, in addition to trying to minimize the increase in unemployment and speed up the decline again, we should be taking measures that try and incentivize
those who face long-term unemployment to take up opportunities that are available, and incentivize employers to favour those job applicants, including the sort of job, the golden hello subsidies that they're talking about in the UK. I think they're in the same vein. There is an absolute priority for the unskilled younger workers that, again, John touched on, who past experience would suggest here and elsewhere can be hardest hit by the recession and by the long-term impact of the scarring on their prospects over their whole careers. What else can we do? And I think we can address some of the poverty and unemployment traps in the welfare system by focusing particularly on support for housing and healthcare costs. We should be targeting child benefit. That's the song Tim Callan and myself have been singing for many a year, and it now seems to be firmly on the agenda. I don't think it matters that much quite how that is done, but there does seem to be a commitment to doing it. We need to shift the burden of taxation. We need to introduce property tax, and again, that's something that's been analysed and is being analysed a lot, but what seems to have changed is not the analysis, but the climate. It's worth saying that if we introduce a property tax and we introduce a carbon tax soon, then that has to be taken into account in thinking about the appropriate level of social welfare support rates. We can develop that in the discussion, John. John again talked about the wage distribution and whether wages are going to come down in nominal terms. If the wage distribution is to shift down in nominal terms, then it seems clear that the minimum wage also has to shift down in nominal terms. But as John said, it's far from clear that that nominal shift is actually going to happen. So just thinking longer term then, I think it's worth emphasising that evidence for Ireland and elsewhere suggests very clearly that concentrating on employment, this might seem like a strange thing to be saying right now, but longer term, job creation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for reducing income inequality towards or to an EU average, much less below it, if that's what we set ourselves as a goal. It makes no sense to see social protection as the problem. It should be seen as part of the solution, not even, I think, as necessarily part of the problem. What we do about pensions, which Colm will be talking about after the break, is fundamentally important for living standards and poverty in particular. The relationship between the social welfare pension rate and the poverty threshold that you choose to use is the single most important thing that will drive what you find if you measure how poverty is changing over time or project it. There's experience from other countries that suggests very strongly that there is not an inconsistency between a high employment rate of the sort that Karl was talking about and effective social protection. And our strategy over the next couple of years has to be about minimising the legacy of the bust, but it would be ridiculously optimistic, I think, to expect that in perhaps 3 or 4 years we won't be focusing on dealing with the legacy, in particular in terms of those who have experienced unemployment over the period. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that presentation, which I think was very interesting, stimulating, and I think your last couple of slides in particular posed some important questions and issues, which I think will tie us nicely into the second session. But I know people probably have some questions, and we allow a few minutes for that, and then perhaps some replies. Karl.
Hi, Brian. A question about what goes with the loads. Aware of that, that's the terminology, but there's a lot of discussion of measures to deal with jobs. It's some independent measure unrelated to other policies to